Would you like to join me in a cup of coffee?
Do you think we can both fit?
What really happened to the cast of Bewitched? There was a time when television still believed in magic, not the kind forged in special effects or big budgets, but in something quieter, warmer. A twitch of the nose, a knowing smile, and the world stood still for just a moment. That was Bewitched. In the stillness of evening, families gathered around the television, and for 30 minutes, reality softened. Samantha Stevens, blonde, graceful, unshakably kind, made people believe that love could still conquer strangeness, that domestic life could hold a bit of wonder. Elizabeth Montgomery was the center of it all, and she made it look effortless. She didn't play a witch. She became one, and in doing so, she cast a spell on a generation. But real life never followed the sitcom script. Behind those charming episodes were actors fighting private wars, with illness, with addiction, with loneliness, with the quiet despair of fading fame. Dick York's body was slowly breaking, even as he tried to stand tall beside Elizabeth. Dick Sargent lived in the shadow of another man, only to find the courage to live in the light as himself. Alice Pierce, Marion Lorne, Agnes Moorehead, each left too soon, their farewells hidden behind laugh tracks and network silence. And Elizabeth herself, so radiant on screen, carried a storm behind her eyes that few ever saw. Time moves forward. The sets are long gone. The studio lights have cooled. But the questions remain. What happens to the people who gave their lives to fiction? When the audience forgets the last laugh, who remembers the ones who carried the story? Bewitched was magic. But its cast, they were heartbreakingly human. If you believe that stories don't end when the credits roll, stay with us. This is where the real tale begins. Follow our channel for the untold lives behind the most beloved faces in television. Elizabeth Montgomery. When Elizabeth Montgomery stepped into the role of Samantha Stevens, she wasn't just acting, she was reshaping what a female lead on television could be. Born in 1933 into a world of privilege and pressure, the daughter of actor Robert Montgomery, she inherited both the spotlight and the emotional weight of living in its glare. Their relationship was strained, and she spent much of her youth walking the delicate line between admiration and defiance. She was 31 when Bewitched premiered in 1964, newly married to the show's director, William Asher, and pregnant with their first child. The show's runaway success made her a household name, but also tethered her to an image she would spend the rest of her life trying to escape. By the final seasons, her on-screen charm gave way to visible fatigue. The magic had dulled. Behind the scenes, her marriage to Asher was collapsing, and the set became a stage for quiet heartbreak. After leaving Bewitched, she made a deliberate turn toward television darker, meatier roles in films. A Case of Rape, The Legend of Lizzie Borden, Black Widow Murders, as if trying to exorcise Samantha's smile. Off camera, she became a passionate advocate for AIDS awareness, gay rights, and animal welfare. And yet, for all her strength, the end came quickly. Diagnosed with colon cancer, she died in 1995, just weeks after the recurrence was discovered. She was 62. Elizabeth Montgomery wasn't just the face of Bewitched. She was its soul. And in the end, she was also its most haunting goodbye. Dick York. Before he became the first Darren Stevens, the mortal husband bewildered by his wife's magic, Dick York was already a seasoned actor. Born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, he grew up in poverty during the Great Depression, raised by a seamstress mother and a salesman father. Acting offered escape. By 9, he was working in radio. By his 20s, he was sharing stages with Elia Kazan and Gene Kelly. Then They Came to Cordura, 1959. During a handcar scene with Gary Cooper, York lifted the full weight of another actor unexpectedly. The muscles along the right side of his back tore, a devastating injury that left him in chronic pain. Doctors prescribed painkillers, and over time, he became physically dependent on them. Not out of indulgence, but out of necessity to keep performing. And perform he did. In 1964, York was cast opposite Elizabeth Montgomery in Bewitched. His Darren was warm, neurotic, and endlessly endearing. A man trying to hold his marriage together, not knowing it was literally held together by magic. But the pain never left. By the later seasons, York was struggling. Some days, he couldn't rehearse. Other times, his body trembled from exhaustion. The crew and cast cared deeply for him, but by season 5, during a scene, he collapsed on set and was taken to the hospital. The producers made the painful decision to replace him. After Bewitched, his health declined. He left Hollywood, lived modestly, and later battled emphysema. But in the quiet of that final chapter, he created Acting for Life, a small but powerful effort to raise funds for the homeless, all from a bed and a telephone. Dick York never returned to stardom, but he never stopped giving. His story is not one of failure, it is one of grace under pain. Dick Sargent. He never asked to be a replacement. When Dick Sargent joined Bewitched in its 6th season, he quietly stepped into a role already beloved by millions, and made it his own, not by imitation, but by restraint. Where Dick York had brought a kinetic energy, Sargent offered steadiness. He didn't try to compete with a memory. He simply showed up, did the work, and stayed present, the way he had always lived his life. Born Richard Stanford Cox in Carmel, California, he carried himself with a quiet elegance that suited the medium of television. There was something dependable about him, a warmth that didn't ask for attention. For years, he moved through Hollywood in guest roles, comedies, and light dramas, a familiar face in an industry built on forgetting. He wasn't chasing stardom. He was just working. Yet beneath the professionalism was a life lived in the margins. For most of his career, Sargent kept a part of himself hidden, not out of shame, but out of survival. He loved deeply. One partner, one quiet home, 2 decades of private joy, but none of it was allowed to exist publicly. Not then. Not yet. It wasn't until the final years of his life, facing the certainty of cancer, that he chose to speak. In 1991, he came out, not with fanfare, but with grace. He called himself a retroactive role model, knowing the time for loud declarations had long passed, but the truth still mattered, especially to those who had none. Dick Sargent died in 1994. No spotlight, no scandal, just a quiet exit. And yet, in the calmness of his presence and the dignity of his honesty, he left behind something quietly revolutionary. Agnes Moorehead. She was never meant to be a television icon. Agnes Moorehead came from the world of stage and radio, steeped in Shakespeare and sermons, her voice a sculptor's chisel, precise, sharp, commanding. When Bewitched came calling, she was already a veteran, a 4-time Oscar nominee, a woman who had stood beside Orson Welles and Citizen Kane and held her own. Taking the role of Endora, the flamboyant, meddling mother-in-law with a flair for sarcasm and chiffon, might have seemed beneath her, but she transformed it into high art. With a single glance, she could steal a scene. Endora was outrageous, yes, but there was something wounded beneath the powder and spells. Agnes played her like a woman who had seen the world disappoint her too many times, and wasn't about to let it happen to her daughter. She was sharp-tongued, but never hollow. She had authority. She had pain. And in Moorehead's hands, she had truth. Behind the screen, Agnes lived like a fortress, elegant, enigmatic, intensely private. Rumors followed her for years. About her personal life. About her relationships. About how she never quite fit into the mold of Hollywood womanhood. She ignored them all. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Toward the end of her life, whispers began to circle, not about scandal, but about something far more haunting. In the mid-1950s, she had filmed The Conqueror in the Utah desert, near a site used for nuclear testing. Years later, it was noted, quietly, then insistently, that many who had worked on that film had died of cancer. Some called it coincidence. Others called it a curse. Agnes Moorehead never commented publicly, but she would succumb to uterine cancer in 1974. For some, the timing was chilling. She was 73 when she passed. And yet, in the eyes of anyone who watched her work, she never truly vanished. Agnes Moorehead didn't just play Endora. She played power, loss, dignity, and vengeance, all in Technicolor. Paul Lynde. There was something about Paul Lynde that made him unforgettable, even when he wasn't meant to be the center of the scene. He didn't walk into a room. He skewered it with a line so sharp, so unexpected, that laughter was the only possible response. In Bewitched, he played Uncle Arthur, the gleefully mischievous warlock who lit up the screen like a firecracker in a candlelit room. He appeared in only a handful of episodes, but that was all he needed. Paul Lynde had a way of lingering. Born in Mount Vernon, Ohio, trained in theater, and seasoned by stand-up stages and Broadway crowds, he brought to television something it desperately lacked: danger wrapped in charm. His delivery was all bite, but underneath the sarcasm was precision, the kind that only comes from years of using humor as both sword and shield. By the time he reached television fame, Lynde had already learned that in Hollywood, timing was everything. He was a regular on Hollywood squares, where his quips became legendary. A household name, yet still something of an enigma. His comedy often danced around the edge of something deeper, a loneliness, perhaps, or a sense of being always slightly out of step with the world he entertained. He struggled with alcoholism, and in private, his life was often chaotic. Friends described him as hilarious and deeply kind, but also volatile, unpredictable. Fame didn't soften him. If anything, it hardened the edges. In 1982, he was found dead in his home at just 55 years old. The official cause, a heart attack. No foul play, no scandal, just silence. And yet, Paul Lynde's absence felt louder than most people's presence. He was more than a punchline. He was a mood, a mirror, a voice that said what others were too polite or too afraid to say. Alice Ghostly. Some performers shine like stars. Others linger like ghosts, gentle presences that don't demand the spotlight, but never quite leave your memory. Alice Ghostly belonged to the second kind. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't loud, but when she stepped into a scene, something shifted. A hush, a softness, a slightly offbeat magic that felt utterly human. She joined Bewitched in 1969 as Esmeralda, the nervous, vanishing housekeeper who replaced the beloved Aunt Clara. It was a daunting task, following Marion Lawrence's Emmy-winning legacy, but Ghostly didn't mimic. She reimagined. Her Esmeralda wasn't bumbling so much as burdened, scared of her own powers, fading in and out of existence not for laughs, but from quiet insecurity. It was comedy wrapped in vulnerability. Long before the sitcom, Alice had built a life in theater and variety. She got her break singing The Boston Beguine in New Faces of 1952, standing beside rising talents like Eartha Kitt and Paul Lynde. Her face was familiar, plain, perhaps, but expressive in ways that made directors lean in. Broadway, game shows, bit parts in films. She worked constantly, rarely loudly, always precisely. She never chased stardom. She chased craft. In her private life, she was devoted to her husband Felice Orlandi, to her sister Gladys, to her quiet routines. When illness came in her later years, strokes, then colon cancer, she faded gradually, like one of her own disappearing characters. She died in 2007. No headlines, no spectacle, just a long goodbye. But for those who watched her, in Grease, in Designing Women, in that odd, tender role as Esmeralda, she left behind something rare, a legacy of softness. In a world that celebrates those who shout the loudest, Alice Ghostly showed the quiet could still echo. Marion Lawrence. Some characters are unforgettable because they remind us of someone we loved, a grandmother, an aunt, a teacher who never quite had control of the classroom but filled it with warmth. That was Aunt Clara, and behind her was Marion Lawrence, an actress who didn't so much play the role as breathe it into existence. By the time she joined Bewitched, Marion Lawrence was already in her 80s. She had spent decades on the stage in London and New York, often cast as fluttery, eccentric women with misplaced purses and nervous smiles. But Aunt Clara was different. There was a sadness beneath the whimsy, a loneliness behind every stammered spell. She wasn't just comic relief. She was the emotional heart of the show. Marion had a gift for confusion, not the kind that begs for pity, but the kind that makes us laugh while touching something deep. She brought to television an innocence untouched by cynicism. Every time she entered the Stevens home with a trembling, "Oh, my stars," audiences smiled. Not at her, but with her. Off-screen, she was much the same. Modest, gentle, endearingly old-fashioned. She lived with her memories and her husband, playwright Walter Hackett, until his death in 1944. She never remarried. She didn't need to. Her world was made of scripts, teacups, and rehearsals. Marion passed away in 1968, midway through the show's run. It was sudden, a heart attack, The producers didn't recast the role. They couldn't. Aunt Clara left the series just as Marion left the world, softly, gracefully, without fuss. A year later, she was awarded an Emmy posthumously. A small statue for a small woman who made millions feel seen. Not every witch on Bewitched cast spells. Some just showed up, shook a doorknob out of their purse, and reminded us how beautiful it is to be imperfect. David White. He was never the lead, never the center of attention. But every great story needs a man like David White. The one in the background, sleeves rolled up, voice crisp, holding the line between order and chaos. As Larry Tate in Bewitched, he played the archetypal boss. Firm, impatient, a little pompous, but oddly likable. You could feel his pulse in every scene. A reminder that magic or not, someone still had to worry about the account. David came from the theater, a stage-trained actor with the posture of discipline and the cadence of authority. He served in the Marines during World War II before returning home to build a life in performance. He did not chase fame, but craft. In Sweet Smell of Success, he played a small, unsettling part, just long enough to prove he belonged in serious company. Then television found him, and Larry Tate became his signature. But there was another side to David White, one the cameras never caught. In 1958, he lost his first wife, Mary Welch, shortly after the birth of their son, Jonathan. The grief didn't break him, but it never left. He raised Jonathan, continued to work, remarried, and found some version of peace. Then in 1988, tragedy came again. Jonathan, now a young man with a life of his own, boarded Pan Am Flight 103. The bomb went off over Lockerbie, Scotland. There were no survivors. Friends said David was never the same. He withdrew from public life, declined interviews, and focused on quiet things: theater, community, reflection. He died 2 years later, in 1990, from a heart attack, just days before the second anniversary of his son's death. Some men vanish in their final act. David White simply folded his grief into silence. But for those who remember Bewitched, and those who've known loss too deep for words, he remains steady, composed, quietly devastated. Alice Pierce. Some actors make us laugh. A rare few make us ache while doing it. Alice Pierce was one of those. As Gladys Kravitz, the nosy neighbor who kept seeing impossible things no one else believed. She became a fixture of Bewitched, the comic pulse of suburban absurdity. Her wide eyes, nervous voice, and perfect timing made every scene she entered shimmer with energy. But behind that laugh was something far more fragile. Alice had built her career on stage and screen playing eccentric women. The ones who were always a little offbeat, a little too honest, a little too loud for the room. She won roles because she was unafraid to be exactly who she was. In On the Town, 1949, her portrayal of the awkward but endearing Lucy Schmueller stood out beside Gene Kelly and Frank Sinatra. Not because she tried to compete, but because she never did. She married twice. Her second husband, stage manager Paul Davis, was by her side during the most painful chapter of her life. Because what few viewers knew was that by the time Bewitched began airing, Alice was already dying. She had been diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer before filming the show. And yet, she kept working. Her performance never faltered. Not once. Week after week, she brought the same nervous brilliance, the same physical humor, the same Gladys. No one on set, not even the producers, truly understood the extent of her illness until it was too late. Alice Pierce died in March 1966. She was just 48. A few months later, she was posthumously awarded an Emmy for her role, a statue that couldn't speak the words everyone who worked with her already knew. She was extraordinary, not because she fought through illness, though she did, but because she never let it define her, not for a single frame. Sandra Gould. To step into a role after someone beloved has passed, that's never easy. When Sandra Gould replaced Alice Pierce as Gladys Kravitz in Bewitched, she wasn't just stepping into a character, but into a space left behind by grief. And yet, she didn't try to imitate. She brought her own rhythm, her own fire. If Pierce's Gladys had been nervous and soft-edged, Gould's was louder, sharper, always one moment away from a shriek. The contrast worked. In its own way, it honored both women. Sandra Gould had spent her entire life performing. Starting in radio in the 1930s, she built a career that spanned mediums and generations. Her voice, unmistakable, fast-talking, a little abrasive, made her a natural for comedy. She played secretaries, neighbors, busybodies, always with impeccable timing. On I Love Lucy, The Brady Bunch, and countless sitcoms, she was the one who walked into a scene and left a mark. But Bewitched made her a household name. For 5 seasons, she was the voice of suspicion, the neighbor who saw just enough to think she was crazy, and just little enough to keep everyone else doubting her. She played it with volume, with urgency, with a kind of comic desperation that bordered on art. Off-screen, she lived a quieter life. She married twice, raised a son named Michael, and remained active in television, voice work, and occasional writing. Her career didn't burn like a firework. It glowed steadily for more than 5 decades. Sandra Gould died in 1999 after complications from a stroke. She was 82. She didn't leave behind headlines or scandals, just a legacy of work, vast, consistent, and full of life. In the end, she did what few could. She stepped into a role made iconic by someone else and left her own imprint, without erasing what came before. George Tobias. In a world of witches, warlocks, and vanishing housekeepers, George Tobias played something much rarer. A man who had no magic at all, and yet still managed to steal the scene. As Abner Kravitz, the long-suffering husband of Gladys, he was the calm amid the chaos, the dry voice of reason that only made the madness funnier. While his on-screen wife flailed in disbelief, Abner barely looked up from his newspaper. That shrug, that weary, "Yes, dear," was comedy gold. But George Tobias had been doing that long before Bewitched. Born to Russian Jewish immigrants in New York City, he made his name on Broadway before transitioning to film in the 1930s. With Warner Brothers, he became a familiar face, often cast as the wisecracking sidekick or the blue-collar everyman. In Yankee Doodle Dandy, Sergeant York, and dozens of wartime dramas and light comedies, he brought an earthy humor that made big stars feel more human just by standing next to him. He never married. No scandals, no dramatic love affairs, just work, steady, unfussy, professional. Off-screen, he was known as private but warm, with a longtime companion often believed to be Millicent Patrick, a trailblazing artist and designer. Their relationship, like much of Tobias's life, was never splashed across magazines. He didn't live to be seen. He lived to perform. When Bewitched came along, it was late in his career. He embraced it without irony, giving Abner a kind of quiet dignity rarely afforded to the husband of the crazy woman archetype. He made the mundane memorable, and in doing so, reminded audiences that not all magic involves spells. George Tobias died in 1980 of bladder cancer. He left behind no children, no autobiography, no farewell tour, just a body of work and a character who, without ever lifting a wand, grounded a fantasy world with one raised eyebrow and a sigh. Maurice Evans. To most television audiences, Maurice Evans was Maurice, Samantha's theatrical, over-the-top father in Bewitched, a warlock with a flair for opera, drama, and disdain for mortals. He floated in and out of the series like a blast of stage fog, grandiose and ridiculous, wrapped in capes and baritones. But for those who knew his work beyond the sitcom, his presence meant something deeper, a legacy of Shakespeare, brought to the small screen with surprising humility. Born in Dorset, England, Evans was raised not merely to act, but to elevate. He brought Hamlet, Macbeth, and Richard II to American audiences at a time when television and theater still kept polite distance. He was, by many accounts, one of the great interpreters of Shakespeare in the 20th century, a man who could deliver soliloquies not as museum pieces, but as living emotion. He served in World War II, where he staged morale-boosting plays for troops. After the war, he became a fixture on stage and in early television, earning acclaim not just for his classical chops, but for his belief that high art belonged to everyone, not just those in orchestra seats. So when Bewitched asked him to play a comedic role in a sitcom, he said yes. Not because it was a step down, but because it was still performance. And Evans, always the professional, delivered every ridiculous line with the gravitas of King Lear. In later years, his health declined. He retired to California, far from London's stages, and passed away in 1989 from cancer and complications of bronchitis and heart failure. No final curtain call, no spotlight farewell. Just quiet, the kind he had rarely known on stage. Maurice Evans brought Shakespeare to television and mischief to magic. In both, he taught us the same lesson. That performance is not about prestige, it's about presence. Bernard Fox. He arrived in a swirl of smoke and accent, wearing absurd capes and waving a cane no one asked for. Dr. Bombay, medicine man to witches and warlocks, was never meant to be subtle, and Bernard Fox made sure he never was. He played the character with gleeful flamboyance, charging into scenes like a colonial ghost who had lost his way but was too proud to admit it. And yet, somehow, he made the absurd lovable. Bernard Fox was born in Wales, the son of a stage actor, and stepped onto his first stage at just 18 months old. By adulthood, he had become a seasoned performer, shaped by wartime service and a lifetime in repertory theater. His clipped mustache, aristocratic delivery, and twinkling eyes made him a perfect fit for eccentric British roles in American film and television. Outside of Bewitched, audiences may remember him as Colonel Crittenden in Hogan's Heroes, or as the doomed lookout in Titanic. Not James Cameron's version, but the 1958 classic A Night to Remember. He had a talent for making even the briefest appearances feel iconic. His was not a face easily forgotten, nor a voice easily mistaken. In Bewitched, he was more than comic relief. Dr. Bombay embodied the chaos of magic, confident in theory, but never quite in control. And Bernard leaned into that chaos with joy. He knew exactly what kind of show he was in, and he made sure you enjoyed it. Fox continued acting well into his later years, never fully retiring, only pausing. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 89, the last surviving regular adult cast member of Bewitched. A final exit, decades after his character's last ridiculous entrance. In a series about magic, Bernard Fox reminded us that the most delightful spells are the ones cast with a wink, a flourish, and absolutely no sense of decorum. When Bewitched first aired in 1964, it was sold as escapism, a whimsical sitcom where magic fixed misunderstandings, where marriages held firm, and where the neighbor's disbelief was the greatest threat to order. But beneath the twitch of Samantha's nose and the laughter of the audience, something more enduring was taking shape. Each actor brought to the show not just performance, but pieces of themselves, their hopes, their exhaustion, their private griefs tucked behind studio doors. Some, like Elizabeth Montgomery, carried the burden of a public smile while quietly breaking. Others, like Dick York, gave everything until their bodies gave out. There were those who stepped in quietly, like Dick Sargent, and those who exploded on screen in unforgettable bursts, like Paul Lynde. Some left too soon, some faded slowly, but all left behind more than characters. They left impressions. In the technicolor comfort of reruns, we often forget how real the cost of these roles could be. Fame never insulated them. Illness still came. Loneliness still waited. And yet, they gave us stories that lasted. Bewitched was never just about spells or sitcom charm. It was about love tested by difference. About ordinary people trying to understand extraordinary ones. About what it means to belong in a world that doesn't always make space for who you are. And maybe that's why we still return to it. Not for the magic, but for the humanity that never needed special effects. Today, the lights have dimmed. The living rooms have changed. But in memory, they remain. Twitching noses, vanishing maids, mischievous warlocks, and weary mortals. All still caught in that perfect moment where time stood still. If these stories moved you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys behind the laughter, and for the quiet truths that lived after the credits rolled.